Hey, thanks everyone for joining. Chris Mitchell has joined me today to talk about his PhD thesis. And let me just quickly state the name of the thesis. It's Roger R. Fairford, Judicial Astrology, England's first astrology book with a question mark. So thanks, Chris, for joining, and it's a pleasure and honor having you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Ashwin. It's a real pleasure and real honour to be here. I've always enjoyed your posts on traditional astrology groups and your talks at the Astrological Association conference. So it's brilliant to be able to share some of these ideas with you and have a two-way conversation about them. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So I mean, we have been in touch on and off about this text, and the moment you made this thesis public, I think many people have been interested looking at the social media posts and so on. And I did not get to it immediately, even though I started reading it immediately. I did not finish it due to various other commitments. But after the Astrological Association conference, I think this was my major, target. And I thought it was a fabulous work. And I hope many people take notice of this work, and because it talks about a specific astrological text that kind of found basis for the future astrological compositions of English language or English tradition. So so let's leave that aside and let's talk about your background as an astrologer a little bit, and then jump on to the actual topic.
Well, I've always been interested in astrology, and I started taking it very seriously in the 1990s. And I, what in the West we would call modern astrology at a fairly standard astrological school in Bristol, where I lived. Nick Campion recommended it and said, oh, yes, there's a little local school that does astrology. It wasn't very expensive. And that was great, but it was just standard modern tropical Western astrology. And later on, I decided that I wanted to do the MA in cultural astronomy and astrology. It looked really interesting. And obviously, modern astrologers know that astrology has ancient roots, but most people don't know much about the history of their own subject. It's just seen as a sort of psychological tool in the West, rather than, well, where did it all come from and how did it arrive? And because I was interested in that, I thought I wanted to do the MA. And I thought, well, I know that history is a big part of it, but I don't know anything about astrology that isn't modern astrology. So maybe I ought to do an astrology course on something medieval. So I did Bernadette Astrologos course in medieval astrology, which was absolutely brilliant. I mean, I really enjoyed it. It didn't do anything about horary astrology. It was all natal astrology, predictive, and so on. But it gave me a really good grounding in what was involved in medieval astrology. And by medieval, we're talking mainly Bernardi from the 13th century. That was who she was working from. And I felt that gave me a little bit of background, so that when I started the MA, I was a bit more comfortable with the history side of things. And so I did the history, I focused on the history module and on the MA, and I actually specialized in looking at Babylonian astrology for my master's degree. And there's vast amounts of work that people can do on that. The great thing about Babylonian astrology was that it was all written on clay tablets, which last for thousands of years. And there's 100,000 of them in the British Museum, untranslated. But I realized that in order to get any further on that, I'd have to do a 7-year course on Assyrian and Akkadian, so I could form and then I'd have to look through 100,000 tablets, most of which are really boring shopping lists, and they're nothing to do with astrology, before you find the one that I want. So I thought, I'm going to do something a bit easier for my PhD, and I'm going to do something medieval. So that's how that started.
Okay, so you had a practice as well even before doing your PhD program, right?
Yeah, I used to have astrology clients and had a small consultancy. I stopped doing that when I was doing the PhD because that was a very long-term project. And because my day job is programming computers for English hospitals, background in IT, my first degree was maths and computer science. So I was also involved in various technical things, like I produced a table of houses and an ephemeris for a magazine back in the early 2000s. So I used to do little bits and pieces like that as well, technical stuff as well as actually seeing clients. I think I prefer the geeky backroom stuff to actually having clients, to be honest.
Great. So, I mean, what is the primary motivation to do a PhD? And as we had an offline talk, like astrology is never recognized as an actual science in the West. So there is no way that an interested person who is probably a practicing astrologer can actually go and do a PhD thesis about proving what astrology is or something like that. So it has to be academic and it has to be historical and it has to be just what earlier astrologers said and it can't be what you are saying. So that's one of the downsides of the fact that astrology is still not being recognized as a valid study in academia of the Western countries. So yeah.
I think that's changing. I think what you said is absolutely correct up until a few years ago. And even when I started doing the MA, which was in 2008, Nick Campion, who was the course director, was very careful about the fact that most of the people in the course were practicing astrologers. But it was like, you mustn't mention the astrology word. You have to put it in some sort of academic context. But because Nick has been working so hard at this, he's actually got academics working together. He managed to organize a conference a few years ago where we had astrophysicists from NASA there, photographers, artists, and astrologers all working together. And there's been an absolute sea change since 2000 because the history of astrology became accepted. It was like, well, even astronomers who hate astrology said, well, we do understand that early astronomers believed in astrology, and astrology was an important part of the history. So long as you can talk about it historically only, that's fine. But I think things have changed. Things really are moving on in academia now. And you are allowed to look at things, even if you are an astrologer. There's this big thing in academia about the insider-outsider debate. You've had it in things like theology for a very long time. It's perfectly okay to look at, say, ancient Egyptian religion, and you don't worship the sun god yourself, but you're allowed to discuss people that did. But if you're a Christian or a Muslim, it's perfectly acceptable to write about your own religious texts from the perspective of somebody who's a Christian or Muslim or what have you. But somehow it wasn't acceptable for somebody who was an astrologer to write about their own subjects' texts from an insider's point of view. And I think that's changed. Okay. And when I started at Leicester, I was really surprised. I thought, oh, I bet everyone's going to think I'm a real oddball doing astrology. And all the other people doing PhDs were doing PhDs on magic symbolism in Rutland churches and snake symbolism in this, that, and the other. And it was like, oh, actually, I'm not the only strange one here. A lot of these people would be considered very oddball just a decade or two ago.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned that some research concerning Babylonian astrology was your primary interest, and then looking at some of the practical difficulties, you had to change your mind to do research on something medieval. So there are so many things to research on medieval astrology, and again, as we were discussing offline, this entire Islamic golden age, which comprises of various scientific and philosophical texts, including astrological texts in Arabic language, makes it a golden age for at least astrologers today, because whosoever has knowledge of translating Arabic astrological materials have a great future ahead of them, and in turn making all of us having a great future ahead of them. So I mean, what kind of basically made you choose the topic that you chose? So that's basically what it is. So there are so many things, but what led you to choose this particular, Roger Herford's work?
Well, I'd always been interested in medieval astrology ever since I did Bernadette's course before I did the MA. So in a way, the Babylonian was a little bit of a digression. I was just annoyed by the fact that everybody thought that everything worth knowing had been invented by the Greeks. And I just wanted to go a little bit further than that, which is why I got interested in Babylonian astrology. But at that time, I still had clients and I was using medieval techniques with them. I was still a modern astrologer, but I was using a lot of these medieval techniques and I was kind of mixing and matching them with modern ones. But the reason that I focused on this is because I was interested in medieval astrology. I decided that's what I wanted to do a PhD in, but I needed to find a topic. And Bernadette Brady came up to me one day and said, I found this brilliant MA dissertation online by somebody called Nicholas White, and he did it in the late 90s, and he'd been looking at a scholar in Hereford in England called Roger of Hereford, who'd written this textbook, and it had loads of techniques in that appeared to be completely original. Nick White said, they don't seem to be in any of the Arabic sources. I think Roger invented all this astrology. And Bernadette was quite excited about the fact that, hey, maybe in England, this little island sort of in the northwest coast, off the northwest coast of Europe, that was a bit of a non-entity in the Middle Ages, had suddenly developed its own astrology all by itself. And this guy is worth looking at. And we've lost it. We haven't heard of any of these techniques. Isn't this amazing? So I thought that sounded a fascinating topic for research. And I thought, great, I'm going to read this text and I'm going to discover all sorts of new astrological techniques that nobody's known about for 800 years. It didn't work out like that. That's the spoiler. But that's what I thought when I started the PhD.
Wonderful. So, I mean, finally, we have a new material about a new astrologer who lived in the 12th century, if I'm not wrong. So, I mean, how did it end up being first astrology book written in England? In which language it was written?
Yeah, this was the reason for the provocative title, because if you say what's the first English astrology book, everybody will say, well, it's William Lilly,
yeah,
which was written in English. Now, Roger of Hereford, in the 12th century, English didn't really exist as a language. I mean, Old English did, but no English person around today, unless they've studied it, could possibly understand Old English. It sounds more like Danish. And in the 12th century, scholars were only writing in Latin in England.
Sure.
And in Christian Europe in the West. The knowledge of Greek and things like that had been lost. So everything was written in Latin. And this textbook is no different. What fascinated me about this textbook, though, what makes it unique, is there were lots of people around in the 12th century who translated Arabic texts into Latin. So why pick on Roger of Hereford, who, let's face it, nobody's really heard of him, whereas they have heard of other scholars, people like Daniel of Morley and Plato of Tivoli and John of Seville, Adelard of Bath, who've translated a lot of these Arabic texts into Latin. Hardly anybody had heard of Roger of Hereford. He was really obscure. And he probably actually went to Spain, and he probably never actually learned Arabic. So he might not even have been a translator. So what's special about Roger? Well, the thing that I found fascinating is he says at the start of his work, well, look, there are all these techniques in a lot of different texts, and I'm putting them together for the benefit of people that want to know more about it into a single book for the very first time. So he claims to have written the first textbook of astrology in England. Because if you look at all the other texts that these 12th century translators translated, they were Arabic texts from Sal and Abu Mashar and Al-Qabisi and people like that. And that was fine, but they were kind of like manuals for people who already understood the basics of astrology. So you know a bit about it. This is what Al-Qabisi says. If you're an absolute beginner, it would be really difficult to work your way through Al-Qabisi or Abu Mashar and learn astrology from it. Even Sal, who has a kind of user-friendly packaging of the material, is still a bit heavy going. And Roger was teaching his students astrology, and this would have been new stuff for them, and everything would have been new stuff. And as I went on, I realized that actually these students weren't people in their 20s or late teens. They were probably school kids of about 13, 14, and he was teaching them astrology. And the other thing I loved is this was at a cathedral school in Hereford. England was a theistic Catholic country. Well, were Jewish communities as well, who were often treated with a little bit of suspicion, but there were interactions between Jews and Christians in England. But he was part of the bishop's household. This would have been with the church's blessing. We're always brought up to think that the church condemns astrology. And here they are in a cathedral school, and he's teaching astrology to school kids. And he's not being shy about it. He's not saying, oh, well, it's so that we can glorify the Lord by learning astrology. No, he says to these kids, why is astrology the finest of all the arts? And the reason he gives is because it lets you see into the future, and that gives you power over other people. Well, that doesn't sound very religious. That sounds like a great motivation for a 13 or 14-year-old boy to want to learn astrology, but it doesn't sound very Christian in that sense. So I just found it fascinating that he was teaching this topic to school kids and not having to apologize for astrology at all, but saying, this is astrology, isn't it brilliant?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned in your thesis as well, I mean, halfway through your thesis, you spoke about how Roger Hereford was almost a promoter of astrology during his times, and it was one of the most fascinating topics. And I think you had also mentioned that he had propagated astrology to a level that people might actually take it more seriously, or some people might consider it more annoying. So, I mean, astrology in the West, I think by 12th century, Islam also banned astrology and considered astrology as a black magic or something. And Christian community had, considered astrology as something like that, even before probably 600 or 700 years before the 12th century or Roger Hereford's time. So astrology being taught to 13, 14 or 15-year-old kids in cathedral community is something fascinating. And I'm sure why I can totally understand why you're fascinated about this particular research. So let's talk a little bit about transmission of astrology into Europe and its arrival in England, because I think that sets a clear backdrop of where we're headed. So, and Roger Hereford's techniques, as we read, and the way he described 7 signs and 12 planets, and some of the techniques that he describes as part of judicial astrology, I feel like there's a thread that ties the Aristotelian philosophy along with astrology in every nook and corner that it carries on, and it becomes inevitable, especially in medieval England or medieval Europe itself, to kind of have such an influence or impression in their work because of where they're drawing upon like their work from. So most of the Islamic astrologers, even early and late Islamic astrologers up to Al-Qabisi, who probably became one of the most influential figures for medieval Europe, arguably more than Abu Mashar. So, most of the Islamic sources and the Islamic tradition is built upon the Aristotelian philosophy itself, and with a little bit of Stoicism and Neoplatonism, kind of here and there. We always see a glimpse of all those things. So it is difficult to kind of do astrology in medieval Europe, and it's difficult to draw astrological texts from the past and compile a new work together without being influenced by Aristotelian philosophy. So what are some of the important works that you thought that made way into medieval astrology? Probably the Eastern Europe, starting from Spain and other areas of Eastern Europe like Italy. So some of the Arabic texts, especially Al-Qabisi's and Abu Mashar's, kind of made their way. And let's make it clear, Al-Qabisi is also Al-Qabisius, right? The same person.
Yes, yeah.
So Al-Qabisius turned out to be the most influential astrologer up to 15th and 16th century. And some of the later Renaissance astrologers also had drawn upon from earlier texts of Al-Qabisi, which were translated into medieval Latin. So how does the medieval sources and other transmissional works of medieval period from Islamic Golden Age affect Roger Hereford's work or impact Roger Hereford's work? So because you have mentioned a table talking about how he mentioned about the association of signs with regions. So that was probably drawn upon from earlier sources, and also the 12 planets and their significations. There is probably a lot of agreed upon significations, and there is nothing really new that Roger Hereford mentions. So some of the knowledge is already existing, but let's talk about where he comes from and how his work was, influenced by earlier astrology.
Right. Well, I think it's worth just quickly mentioning the structure of Roger's book because it's very, very confusing, and it
Yeah.
confused cataloguers in libraries because he starts off with a prologue saying, "I'm putting all this material together for the first time into a book," and the book is in four parts. It's there's a book on basically astrology. It's horary astrology. It's a horary textbook. Then there's a bit on intentions. Then there's a bit on elections. And the fourth part is the method of judging, which is all a bit vague. And then he launches straight into this huge, great reference section that takes up more than half the manuscript. And you think, well, okay, this must be the first book. But then it finishes, and then it says, and here begins the book on on astrology. And it's like, well, hang on, this is the first book. So what's this reference thing doing here? But this was quite common in medieval times. If you're going to write a book, you might actually give them a little reference bit up front to give them all the basics before you start writing your book. So this reference material, which takes up half the manuscript and is often considered to be a completely separate text by some librarians, the reference bit, there's nothing new in there at all. It's basically a compilation of things from Abu Mashar and Al-Qabisi and a few other sources, but it's mainly Abu Mashar and Al-Qabisi. Roger gets very confused about the allocation of signs to places because Arabic place names often didn't mean anything to 12th century English scholars. And so, the land of Gog and Magog, well, nobody knows what that is, or the land beyond the Turks. And remember, Turks didn't live in Turkey in the 12th century. They lived in Turkmenistan and Central Asia. So a lot of these places didn't really mean very much. So when you look at, so Roger just left some of them out and thought, oh, well, I know where so-and-so is, and I know where such and such a place is. I know where Palestine is. I know where, well, Rum, we don't know about Rum. Does they mean Rome, or do they just mean the Christian Empire? And they probably just meant the Christian Empire. Roger was a bit confused by that. So a lot of the place names got a bit confused, but by and large, there's nothing new in there. It's the reference section is just a compilation of stuff from Al-Qabisi and Abu Bashar. And sometimes he leaves bits out that make it meaningless. So one of them is the table of degrees that are sort of positive and negative degrees, which is in a text, I can't remember off the top of my head who it's by I think a Greek, from a Greek source, but he doesn't go into detail. He just says, oh, there are 19 full degrees, there are 19 empty degrees, and there are 11 full degrees in this sign. Well, that's not very helpful because you need to know that the first three are empty, the second two are full, the first, and so on. And it's meaningless just to put them up. But he obviously didn't understand that bit, so he left that out. So some of the reference material is he obviously didn't understand himself, but it was just basically a reference text so that people knew what the basic features of signs and planets were. His original work was what comes afterwards, which is his work in 4 parts, where he's talking about horary and then he's talking about intentions. And again, they're not original in the sense that he didn't actually invent a lot of the techniques that Nicholas White, writing 25, 30 years ago, thought he had. The reason for Nick White's confusion there is because he was writing in the 1990s. We didn't have access to a lot of these Arabic texts years ago. And so he hadn't seen it in the edition of Abu Mashar that he'd looked at, but it was in places like Ibn Ezra, who'd got it from another earlier Arabic source. It was in various other Arabic texts that we now have access to. So actually Roger wasn't inventing his new techniques of his own. And why would he? I mean, this is new stuff to him. It would be a bit stupid to come all this new stuff and then start inventing your own stuff as well. But what he did do was package it beautifully. So in his book on horary, he starts off by saying, okay, look, all these textbooks, it's quite easy. If you look at something like Sahl and you want a question about will my foreign journey be successful, you have to go through a list of hundreds of questions, and eventually you'll come across a 9th house question relating to travel, and then you can follow the rules. Roger says, look, it's a lot easier than that. You've got two planets that you need to look at: the Lord of the Ascendant, the ruler of the Ascendant, and the Moon. That represents you, the person asking the question. Now, whatever your question's about, it's going to relate to a house. So if it's about marriage, it'll be the 7th house. If it's about foreign travel, it'll be the 9th house. So if you're asking about a journey, then you look at the ruler of the 9th house and you say, okay, is the ruler of the ascendant, you, making a nice aspect to the planet that rules the journey? If it is, then it's going to be a successful journey. If it isn't, then it won't be. So that's a nice, easy, simple rule that a 13-year-old can follow. Then he says, sometimes that doesn't work because maybe the Lord of the Ascendant's in a bad condition, and then you have to use something else. And he starts introducing all these other horary rules and building them up bit by bit. Just as today, if you were to start a horary course at a school of horary astrology, they would start with the simple stuff. And then as you progress through the course, they would add more complexity to it and say, here are some rules to do if this doesn't work. And that's what Roger's doing. He's teaching very much like a modern teacher. Now, in terms of the religion and how does he tie this in and make it acceptable to the church? Well, frankly, he doesn't really seem to bother. He does say, astrology will tell you everything other than the mind of the creator himself. So he has to give a little bit of a sop. So obviously, I'm not trying to mess with God here. But apart from that, he doesn't. He just gives the rules and that's it. And I don't think the condemnation against astrology seems to have been later on. We have to remember it in the 12th century. We had this huge melting pot of Jews, Muslims, and Christians working in places like Toledo together, translating texts, teaching each other, and none of them were frightened of astrology being somehow blasphemous. I mean, you do get Abu Mashar having to write a chapter explaining why astrology is okay, and you do have to give indications to gods to make sure it's okay. And some astrologers in the Arabic writings are having to justify why they're doing astrology and getting into arguments with other people that don't agree with it. But by and large, it was not only tolerated, but it was used and encouraged and taught.
Great. So, let's quickly move on to some of the house calculations. So you had a chapter mentioning about the calculation of houses and also the zodiac. So there was knowledge of the two forms of zodiac existed, like tropical and sidereal zodiac. And you had also given the way of calculating how Roger calculated the house cusps and, calculated the topics of houses. So it's quite clear that he used quadrant house systems, so which was predominantly used in after the Greek astrological tradition. So do you want to talk a little bit about that in terms of what forms of systems he used and how he calculated the houses?
Yes, Nick White, when he wrote his MA, was convinced that Roger was using a sidereal system rather than a tropical system. I don't think he was, but I think his astrolabe was definitely based on sidereal positions, because what he says is if you're using an astrolabe to work out house positions, there's a list on the back saying when the sun goes into Aries, when does the sun go into Taurus, and the back of the astrolabe would tell him that. And then he says, but remember, you have to add 9 degrees. And I think he's saying that because he's saying my astrolabe is sidereal, but if we're following these Arabic texts, we're going to have to be tropical, and that means we have to add 9 degrees, which was roughly the offset at the time. So I think there was some confusion there, and he often, and he brings this 9-degree thing in quite a bit. But in the example chart he gives in his book, you can see that he is using a tropical zodiac there, and that he is using Alcobaeus' house system. That's the one developed by Al-Kabisi. Now, for an astrolabe, it's very easy to draw up charts and work out house cusps if you've got an astrolabe of Arabic origin, and Europeans started making them shortly afterwards. You could just move your slide around and just read off the house positions, and you end up with Alcobaeus' houses. Of course, what he doesn't tell you is how to calculate where the planets are, which is a very important aspect. And we know that he does know how to do that. And he obviously assumed that his student, because he wrote tables showing planetary positions, but that's not in this textbook. And we assume that his students already knew how to do that, or that they would have access to an ephemeris for that particular year where somebody else has done the computations for them. He also says if you haven't got an astrolabe, you can use my handy little table here to draw up house positions through how to work that out. So he's got 2 ways of calculating houses, one using a a table that he's had to create himself for the latitude of Hereford, and the other is using an astrolabe. And of course, he had to do the tables himself because any of the Arabic tables, even the tables from southern Spain, wouldn't work at the latitude of Hereford, which is 52 degrees north. So he had to rewrite them for that latitude.
Sure. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about associating regions with the zodiac signs. So where does he draw? Do you think we can share the screen and
Yes.
I have it right in front of my.
Oh, you do you? Yeah, that'd be easier if you can.
Yeah, because I
on
thought
another computer here.
okay, I thought that was extremely interesting because one moment, let me just quickly. Is it visible now?
Yes, that's fine. I could read that.
Okay, so Aries. I mean, Al-Qabisi associates with Babel, Faris, Babylonia, Adra beginning. This is probably Azerbaijan, where I think you also mentioned it. Palestine is Palestine, and so there is not much difference between Roger's association and Al-Qabisi's association because probably all these areas cover Al-Qabisi's regions as well, right?
That's right. And by looking at the text, because we have John of Seville translated Al-Qabisi's Introduction to Astrology into English, and John of Seville also translated Abu Mashar into English, and so did Herman of Carinthia. Now, Herman of Carinthia's translation of Abu Mashar is a lot shorter than John of Seville's, and he's kind of paraphrased, whereas John of Seville has been very accurate to the Arabic. And we can see when we look at Roger's sources, he sometimes uses sentences in this section that are absolutely identical to Herman of Carinthia's version of Abu Mashar. And he's also used sentences that are absolutely identical to John of Seville's translation of Al-Qabisi. So we can be pretty certain that Roger wasn't paraphrasing. He was literally just copying and pasting from either Al-Qabisi or Abu Mashar into his textbook.
Sure. So basically, Roger does not give any associations with Taurus, but Al-Qabisi and Abu Mashar continue to, give for Taurus as well. So, I'm not sure why Roger has not given any association of region with Taurus. Was it probably, missed, or do you think there is a specific reason for why it was missed?
If you look at those places that were listed in the Arab ones, I'm guessing that Roger had no idea where Ezuet, Al-Mehin, Handan and Al-Akrad were. So he thought it was best just to leave them out. I think the problem is a lot of these places are a bit obscure if you're in an English city. And in fact, on the thesis, I've got maps showing this is where Al-Qabisi has put the dots for things. And if you go down a little bit further, so on there, I've done it, I think, for each. I've done it for each sign. So,
I'll just move forward and see.
Yeah, so there we are. On that one, for example, there's Taurus, was on that previous page at the top. And I've color-coded it so that you can see that Taurus was associated with all sorts of places. It would have been a bit difficult for Roger to have pinned it down and said, well, which one are we talking about? Different authors associated with all over the place. Uzbekistan, maybe Afghanistan, maybe Iran, maybe Cyprus, maybe Anatolia. And it's like, so you can imagine Roger thinking, well, I don't know, which one, I haven't heard of half of these places, which one am I supposed to choose? Whereas some of them are clearer, and Al-Qabisi and Abu Mashar and all agree, yes, it's associated with that. And Roger can then put that down and say, well, everybody seems to agree that, it fits for Jerusalem or Cairo or Egypt or whatever.
Interesting. So Roger agreed with all authors on Egypt, but has Cappadocia, which only Abu Mashar had. So yes. in case of Gemini, so probably it says that Roger had agreed with all the medieval astrologers except for Abu Mashar. Let's quickly jump back and see which areas Roger associated with Gemini. So he Armenia, Egyptus, and Cappadocia. I have no idea what
Yeah.
Cappadocia is, but Egypt is Egyptus is Egypt or Hellenistic Egypt. I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah, Cappadocia, I think, is part of Western Turkey, sort of near Constantinople and that sort of area.
Oh, interesting. So
Abu Mashar had that, but nobody else did.
Oh, okay. So I think he almost agrees with Abu Mashar as well, but it just does not mention some of the regions. So Armenia is
Yeah.
here, and Cappadocia
And
is here.
Cappadocia's there, which Roger's got, but
Yeah.
Al-Qabisi doesn't have it. And it's not in Abu Mashar's introduction,
Yes.
abbreviation, much smaller work either.
Okay.
I don't think he's got anything for, is it Pisces he hasn't got anything for?
Yeah,
because
I noticed.
it's fairly obscure.
Yeah. So he associates Gracia. Gracia is probably Greece.
Yes. And
Okay.
he's also got parts of Gaul and Rome, but then that could be anything. And if you're in a Western Christian country, Italy and Greece, basically that kind of means the whole of the, what the Muslims called Rum in that time. And
Oh, okay.
Rome, it means the Western, it means that lot over there, the Europeans. And Roger
Okay.
can't very Europe because he's in Europe and he's got to be a bit more specific. So I think that's why he left that one out.
So it's interesting that Abu Mashar has given none here, or probably he did not have access to what Abu Mashar mentioned for Sagittarius.
Yeah, that's Abu Mashar's introduction has none in. Now that was translated by Adelard of Bath, and I don't know whether it was simply part of a page had got lost.
Oh, okay.
We don't have that many transcriptions of it. It would be surprising that Adelard of Bath didn't bother putting it in. And since Abu Mashar did have Ispahen for Sagittarius in the full work, why wouldn't he have put something in the abbreviation? So I think that might just be a bit of lost text there.
Okay. So, and it's, but on the other hand, it's also very difficult to kind of find out why Roger or any astrologer associates this particular region with this particular sign. And it's interesting to see Ethiopia and India in same sign like Sagittarius. So, jumping back to Cancer. So it would be interesting to compare with other astrologers from the Renaissance period as well, but that's probably for another time because I did not plan for it. It just strikes my mind now. It would be interesting to see what Lilly had mentioned as opposed to Roger or other medieval astrologers. So
I do have a list of all of the ones that were done by various astrologers, and we also are very lucky because the problem is we don't know where some of these place names are.
Okay.
Have astrolabes, Arabic astrolabes that list place names on the back together with their latitudes and longitudes. Now, latitude is easy. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're ancient Greek or Indian or medieval or modern. 52 degrees north is pretty clear cut. Everybody can work out, can agree on a latitude. Longitude's much more of a problem. Obviously, they didn't have the Greenwich meridian in the 12th. So where do you measure your longitude from? Some people use the Canary Islands. Other authors used somewhere in the Black Sea, which by coincidence happens to be about, their 0 point happens to be about 36 north and 36 east. Others used some mythical lands that was like somewhere in the Atlantic, which for reasons that nobody really knows. So different authors use different starting points for longitude, but we can calibrate it by saying, aha, well, we know that this particular city is considered, like Baghdad, is considered to be 10 degrees west by this system, and it's considered to be 20 degrees east by this system. So we therefore know where their starting points are. And so then the other cities all fall into place. So I've got some huge, great spreadsheet with all the possible variants on. And it's just a complete mess. Trying to draw those maps was a nightmare because every author just has a different list of places in many cases.
No, I think the maps were extremely helpful in kind of seeing which author placed which region or associated with which signs. So this particular area was extremely interesting for me and fascinating to see how each author kind of associated the signs with regions. So,
well, some of them are really like the lands of Gog and Magog. and others were lands beyond the mountains. And there was one that appears to be, you know, the North Pole pretty much. And it's like, well, nobody ever went to the North Pole, so I don't know how they did that. And how did these authors come up with these attributions in the first place? There doesn't seem to be any logic behind them.
Okay. So 4 parts of the book, I think you already mentioned, but just moving, just to touch upon. So we still have no clear reference as to which book he associates with Book 4, the Judgments, or any other book that he mentions, which we probably may not have had access to. Is that the case, or?
Yeah, it's there are 27 existing manuscripts of this text, and they vary. Some of them don't include the reference section, some of them do. Some of them only include the reference section and miss out the actual main part of it. But Roger in the prologue is very clear. He names the 4 parts, and that's nice and easy. And then in the Selden manuscript, which is the oldest one we've got, that's 13th century. It would have been a few decades after Roger that was written. We think Roger probably wrote in about 1176, something like that. Selden manuscript is early 1200s, 1210s, maybe 1220s. So not long after Roger had written it. It'd be lovely to find the original one that Roger wrote, but we haven't got that. And in the Selden one, it's very clear because it actually says, incipit liber intentiones, you know, this is the beginning book of intentions, and it's marked as a separate book. And that's done for the first book, the second book, and the third book. And then the 4th one, there isn't, it just runs into it, which is why, well, was there actually a 4th book? Again, Nick White thought there probably wasn't. And I was inclined to agree with him on that. But then I found, I think it was a German manuscript, where in the margin, it's very clearly written 4th. In other words, this is the start of the 4th book. And some of the manuscripts had the 4th part missing, which implies that the 3rd book really did end at that point. So I think Roger did give us the entire promised 4 books, but the last book is really only a page long, and it's basically a list of, oh, and by the way, here's a few other rules that you might want to take into account that he really glosses over, like don't forget the annual revolutions, don't forget functions of Jupiter and Saturn, but he doesn't say how to use them. It's just like, I've given you all the rules, but don't forget there's this whole other list of things that you need to bear in mind as well. So it's not really a textbook, just if you like, it's almost like, and here's some further reading for you to do.
Interesting. So the first book is all about nativities, and then, interrogations, nativities, and then elections. So
first is just about, it's only horary. He doesn't seem to be doing natal astrology. Again, the chart that he gives, Nicholas White postulated that it was the birth chart of Eleanor of Aquitaine, but I disagree with him on that. I don't think it was. And the entire book is about, first book is about horary and how you choose a question. And all the references are from horary Arabic textbooks. So it's definitely a horary textbook. And then the second one is intentions, which seems really weird because if somebody comes to you as a horary astrologer, you think, well, they know why they're coming to see you. So why do you need to know their intention? But it can be useful. It's almost psychological, isn't it? Like modern astrologers will draw up a consultation chart to find out what it's all about.
That's what I thought about, because the way you mention in the book about how Roger had actually split up his 4 books is quite interesting, because it gives an insight into what he was doing with which. But when you talk about interrogations and then finding the right times, it again brings, whether it is horary or electional, or is it a mix of both horary and electional. And the one that you mentioned about now, intentions. So this kind of makes me think about the thought interpretations, which was a specific terminology used by Ben Dykes to talk about early Greek authors in his works like Hephaestion of Thebes and Choices in Inceptions, which was also a compilation of medieval authors. So I was wondering whether if it could be a treatise on both horary and electional, but I think now you kind of make it clear that it is probably a consultation chart, which is even an interesting idea to kind of contemplate. So
I owe a huge debt of thanks to Ben Dykes, because on the intentions bit, I was puzzling over this for a year or so, thinking, well, this just doesn't make any sense. I mean, one of the things is, according to the Lord of the Hour, you can find out the intention and the hidden thing. And the hidden thing was, it's the second part of the Hour of Jupiter or whatever. The hidden thing is a bat's head or a bird of two colours. I'm thinking, well, what on earth does that mean? And Ben Dyke said, yeah, William Lilly used this as well. It's been used throughout history. The Arabs used it. And the idea is that an astrologer is a bit of a magician, really. And that's what people thought in medieval times. So somebody comes to see you as an astrologer, and you can tell them that they have a wart on their left buttock or something. And there's no way you could have known that, except you're an astrologer and you know about hidden things. So the hidden bats, the bat's head or the bird of many colours, could be they've got a lucky charm on them and it's hidden. And as the astrologer, I say, oh, I think you've got a lucky charm on you, a bat's head perhaps, or a multicoloured feather. And they'll go, oh, actually I have, yes. You must be a good astrologer because you knew about that. And of course, the whole intentions thing is quite interesting, because the person might come to see the horary astrologer, to give a simple example, and say, I'm really worried about my father. He's ill. Is he going to survive this terrible illness that he's got? Now, that's a perfectly good horary question. It'll be a sixth house question about illness, or maybe a turn sixth house, as it's about the father's illness. And you could see how to delineate that. But of course, the actual intention, the reason that the person might have come to see the astrologer, isn't because he cares about his father recovering from his illness. He wants to know when he's going to get his hands on his inheritance, which is a very different question. If he'd said to the astrologer, when am I going to get my inheritance? That would have been an eighth house question. So the astrologer needs to know, okay, I know that you're asking me this question, but what do you really want to know? What's the real intention behind you coming to see me? That's why I say it's a little bit psychological. And today, you could do that by saying, well, I've got your natal chart here, but I've also drawn up this chart for the consultation to tell me what's really going on. You can't do that with horary, because the person turns up to see the astrologer, the horary chart is for now, and the consultation chart is for now. So they're going to be identical charts. So therefore, you have to have different techniques to determine the attentions than you do for doing the horary itself. And that's what the second book is about. Here are the ways to find out the intention of the questioner, and they're different to the ordinary horary techniques that we use to answer the questioner's question.
Yeah, cool. I think you mentioned most of what you said in the book as well, and there is towards the end of the book, I think you mentioned about the hidden things, and you quoted Masha Allah, and I just don't remember other authors. So I think one of the texts that Ben Dykes. Okay, yeah.
Ben gave me a copy very generously of On the Search of the Heart.
Yeah.
Which was one that he.
Yeah, that was the one I was mentioning.
And Ibn Ezra comes up with similar things as well. And I think there was eventually, I can't remember off the top of my head, where the stuff about hidden objects came from. But I did find a source that had something very, very similar in, that was an Arabic source. So
I think Masha Allah's hidden things as well.
Yes, yeah. So yes, I can't remember exactly where that came from, but yeah, I can't find it in there at the moment.
No, it's okay. But I mean, I was just trying to kind of, see what are the possible sources. But I think anyone who is listening to this can easily go to the theses, download, and just read them. And there is an interesting section about in the chapter 5 of Judicial Astrology Techniques, hidden objects from the Lord of the Hour. So this is something that people do even in the modern times, but this technique was largely forgotten, and we had to revisit and kind of translate some of the Arabic texts, and usage of Lord of the Hour in horary, especially to find hidden objects. So that was one of the fascinating things that I wanted to mention, which I enjoyed reading in this. I think it's a fabulous work, but there are little fragments that kind of keep you tied to this work, where you just cannot leave without finishing it. So, uh,
Mm.
so I think I kind of, asked you everything, whatever I wanted to ask, and this was a very enlightening discussion, which we also tied a little bit of history of astrology, necessarily so. And did you want to mention about something as part of this talk, or that is tied to this particular project that you did?
I've got an article summarising the intentions thing in the Astrological Journal, the July-August edition of the Astrological Journal, which is a much easier read than the thesis itself, which is 322 pages long. Anybody's very welcome to download the thesis. All Leicester PhDs are in something called the Leicester Research Archive, and they're all freely available. So you're very welcome to download that and read it. But what I want to do is I do want to write a more astrologer-friendly version of this thesis that's easier to follow and is a little bit easier in reading style as well, and summarises the important points. Because obviously when you're doing a PhD, you're doing original research and you have to absolutely justify everything.
Yeah.
People don't want to read through a page of, here's some Latin in John of Seville, here's some Latin in Herman of Corinthia, here's Roger's Latin, oh look, he must have been using that one there. Most people will just take my word for it if I say, yeah, he was using Herman of Corinthia's translation for that bit. But for a PhD, you have to prove it. So I want to cut it down by producing something that focuses on the astrology, does less on the analysis of all the Latin, which is a little bit tedious, to be honest, and hopefully publish something that's a little bit more readable. But in the meantime, anyone's very welcome to download the thesis and read it for themselves, of course.
Great. So this kind of just struck my mind now. So do you want to talk about the journey of this PhD, how long it took, and what are some of the sources that you banked upon to do this PhD? Because any PhD, as you said, you have to prove whatever you write. So you needed to have a backing up material to kind of prove what you did, or some kind of a manuscript. So did you find all the manuscripts in England itself, or did you have to travel for this sake? I think you had to travel for this sake, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, initially, when I started in 2011, did the PhD part-time, and initially I was looking at manuscripts in Cambridge University Library and Oxford Bodleian Library. And in those days, it was a right pain. Things have changed dramatically just in the last few years. I mean, 2011 is only 9 years ago. But for example, in Cambridge, they allowed me to take pictures of the manuscript, and then I could look at them at home and at my leisure and blow them up and work out the Latin. Oxford wouldn't let me do that. They had a reprographics department that were going to charge £15 a page. Oh. And there were about 100 pages, and I thought, I'm not paying £1,500 to read this. It was really difficult. I had just had to work off 2 manuscripts to begin with. But then as the PhD developed, the Bodleian Library suddenly got a lot more liberal and allowed you to take photographs yourself. And so I ended up with a few manuscripts, but then the internal examiner thought I needed more than that, and that really I needed to analyse them and work out which is the correct one. I mean, they were all very similar. The text was pretty much word for word the same. But then I eventually located 27 manuscripts, and a lot of those weren't in the UK, but I didn't need to travel for that, because some of them, like the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, make all their manuscripts available online, which is great. The Vatican Library make all their manuscripts online. They're all digitized. And some of the other libraries were really helpful and sent me photographs of the emailed me digitized photographs of the microfilms that they had of these manuscripts. Some of them charged, some of them didn't, so it was 30 or 40 euros for some of them, and others just very kindly sent them to me free of charge, which was extremely generous. And some of them were in, little local libraries in France and Germany and things like that, and others were amazing, really, in their archives. So I did manage to actually get copies of every single page of all of the 27 manuscripts, which,
wonderful.
When you look at, say, Nicholas White, who was writing 30 years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. We didn't really have photography in the 1990s, and they certainly hadn't digitized manuscripts. So he had to work off 2 manuscripts, and that was it. I was able to work off 27, which makes life a lot easier. I wouldn't have been able to do this PhD 30 years ago. So I've got digital photography and the works of people like Ben Dykes, Chris Brennan and so on, who've been translating various texts. And as I say, particularly Ben and people at Project Hindsight mean that we now have, and Charles Burnett, of course, at the Warburg Institute, we now have all these translations of Arabic texts into English. And not just Latin. My only Abu Mashar was a major one. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to the English translation because that was only produced a few months ago, which is an absolute. So I was working off the Latin for that. But yeah, it was a lot easier because I did have access to those manuscripts. But on the way, I had to learn Latin. I had to learn paleography. So there was quite a bit of, going on fairly intensive Latin courses, fairly intensive paleography courses, and trying to get to grips with some very strange handwriting and some very strange Latin constructs. But it's been worthwhile and really enjoyable.
Awesome. So I think that kind of marks the end of the discussion. And I mean, as you said, the work is freely downloadable, and I think everyone should kind of take a look at it and read it for their own purpose and see, and because it gives a lot of insight into what and how much goes into a PhD in history of astrology from an academic point of view. And I think you made it readable for both academicians and also astrologists. So there are some truly scholarly work, especially when it comes to the manuscript decoding and all those things, which will interest the actual academicians. But I think there is a lot of stuff that normal astrologists practicing astrologists can just go and read it and use them or put them in their practice. So thank you so much for even getting into this and successfully completing it, because it's a wonderful resource, and I've been saying it ever since it was made public. So thank you so much again for doing this, and thank you so much for joining today.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ashwin. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.